A half-blood girl was buried alive, but the wolf pack dug her out and changed everything. The wind across Cold Creek was a desolate thing, carrying the grit of the plains and the town's three ugliest truths: suspicion, resentment, and a brittle, pious hope. Waya ignored it all. Her hands stained with earth and herbs worked with a quiet purpose at the edge of the woods, gathering medicine for her grandmother. This was her world, the line between the town that called her half-breed and the wilderness that called her kin. She possessed a grit they could never understand, a resilience forged in silence and solitude. But the townsfolk didn't know her secret. They didn't know that every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves was a conversation. Her true family wasn't in the town or the tribe. They were deeper in the shadows with fur of silver and eyes of amber. Today, however, the forest was different. Too quiet. A twig snapped behind her, a heavy, clumsy sound. Not an animal. The whispers of the wind died, and in the sudden, predatory silence, Waya knew. She hadn't come looking for trouble, but a pack of bad eggs had just brought it right to her doorstep. The wind across Cold Creek was a desolate thing, a high, thin whisper that scoured the land and carried the town's three ugliest truths: suspicion, resentment, and a brittle, pious hope. It kicked up dust that tasted of iron and settled in a fine red film on every soul. Waya felt it on her skin as she stood before the mercantile, a ghost made of quiet defiance. The town watched her. It always watched. From the shadowed porch of the saloon, from behind the starched lace curtains of the land office. Today the stairs were sharper edged with a fresh bitterness from the festival 2 days prior. Jed, the blacksmith's son, swaggered out of the mercantile, his friends trailing behind him like stray dogs. He stopped, deliberately blocking her path. "Look what the wind blew in." He sneered, his voice loud enough for half the street to hear. "Ain't you a little far from the woods breed?" Waya's jaw tightened, a flicker of stone in her moss-green eyes. She said nothing. Her silence was a language he could never learn, a weapon he couldn't counter. She simply waited, her posture unbroken, her gaze level. He wanted a reaction. A flinch. A tear. She gave him nothing but the vast, silent patience of the forest itself. With a frustrated grunt, he spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near her worn boots. "Go on, then. Skedaddle back to your dirt floor hovel." She moved past them, her shoulders squared against the weight of a name she had not chosen but was forced to carry. Each step away from the town's suffocating judgment was a breath of cleaner air, a return to a world that made sense. Her cabin, nestled where the pines began their climb up the mountain, was a sanctuary of wood smoke and dried herbs. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the scent of pine tea, and the soft, rasping sound of her grandmother's breathing. They were cruel today. The old woman murmured from her cot by the fire, her eyes closed. She hadn't needed to see. She could read the tension in Waya's silence. The wind was just sharp. Grandmother Waya lied, softly kneeling beside her. She placed a cool hand on the old woman's forehead. The fever was worse. The rattling in her chest was deeper. The sky whisper root, her grandmother rasped, a dry cough shaking her frail frame. It grows only where the mountain weeps. You must be careful. I will, Waya promised, her heart a cold knot in her chest. She prepared a small leather pouch, her mind already mapping the treacherous path to the waterfall high on the ridge. As she packed a small piece of dried meat, her fingers brushed against a long, silvery scar on her forearm. The memory rose unbidden. Winter, a year ago. A flash of white fur and dark blood against the snow. It was him, the great white wolf the hunters called Ghost, caught in a rusted bear trap. He was a legend, a phantom, and he was dying. His eyes, burning amber pools of agony and rage, had dared her to come closer. She had. For 3 days she had stayed with him. She never got too close, just close enough to leave a small offering of jerky to speak in a low, soothing cadence. On the third day, his feverish gaze had softened. He let her approach, let her use the herbs her grandmother had taught her to clean the festering wound, let her work the cruel metal jaws of the trap open with a fallen branch. He had not made a sound. When he was free, he had stood, looked at her for a long, profound moment, and then vanished into the trees. She never saw him again, not up close. But sometimes in the twilight she would see a flash of white watching her from the ridge, a silent guardian, an unspoken debt. Shaking the memory away, she stood. She kissed her grandmother's forehead, the skin as thin and dry as parchment. "I will be back before the moon is high." Her grandmother's hand clutched hers weakly. "The forest knows you, little bird. It will keep you safe." Waya stepped out into the crisp, cold air, the weight of her promise settling upon her. The path into the woods was familiar, a welcoming embrace of shadow and pine. The air grew still, the chirping of birds fading as she went deeper. A profound silence fell, the kind that comes just before a storm, the kind that comes when a predator is near. She stopped, her hand resting on the handle of her skinning knife, her senses screaming. The forest knew her, yes, but she had forgotten that men like Jed were not of the forest, and they had followed her. She found it where the mountain wept. A fine, silver mist clung to the rocks behind a curtain of falling water, and there nestled in the damp black earth was the sky whisper root. Its leaves were the color of twilight, its delicate stem pulsing with a faint, cool energy against her fingertips. Hope, pure and sharp, pierced the cold knot in Waya's chest. She had the medicine. Her grandmother would be well. The thought was a prayer whispered to the ancient stones and the sighing pines. For a fleeting moment the world was a place of profound peace, a sacred contract between her and the wild. The peace shattered like glass. "Well, looky here, boys." Playing with weeds again, Breed Jed's voice was a violation in this quiet place. He and his two shadows, Caleb and Finn, stepped out from behind a cluster of aspens, their smirking faces ugly and out of place against the backdrop of serene nature. They moved with the clumsy arrogance of men who believed they owned everything they walked on. Waya rose slowly, the precious roots clutched tight in one hand. She did not speak, her silence a shield. That tracking prize at the festival, Jed continued stepping closer. His eyes narrowed with resentment. "Should have been mine. No half-blood girl can track better than me. You must have cheated. Used some of your Injun tricks." Waya finally met his gaze, her own eyes as cool and clear as the waterfall behind her. "The forest doesn't lie, Jed. Tracks don't cheat. Some people just don't know how to read them." The truth of it struck him like a physical blow, and his face contorted in a mask of raw fury. The thin veneer of superiority cracked, revealing the bitter insecurity beneath. "Why, you little—" He lunged for the pouch of herbs. Instinct honed by a life of watching and listening took over. Waya sidestepped faster than he anticipated. She was a creature of the woods, agile, sure-footed. She shoved him hard, and he stumbled back into Caleb. For a second, the three of them were a tangle of limbs and curses, surprised by her ferocity. She was not a frightened doe. She was a cornered lynx. But there were three of them. Finn grabbed her from behind his arms, locking around hers. Caleb wrenched the pouch from her grasp, the precious roots spilling onto the dirt. Jed, his face crimson with humiliation, advanced on her. "You think you're better than us? You think you belong here?" He snarled, his voice thick with hate. He shoved her. Hard. Her feet, tangled in the undergrowth, found no purchase. She stumbled backward, a cry tearing from her throat as the ground beneath her simply vanished. She fell, landing with a sickening thud at the bottom of a deep, narrow pit, an old animal trap forgotten by time. The fall knocked the wind from her lungs, pain exploding in her shoulder. Above their faces appeared framed against the circle of sky. For a heart-stopping moment, they just stared, their expressions a mixture of shock and fear. This was the moment of choice. The moment they could have pulled her out, run away, and left it as a cruel accident. But Waya saw the choice being made in Jed's eyes. A dark, terrible idea slithered into them, twisting his fear into something monstrous. No one will ever know he whispered the words barely audible, yet they echoed in the pit like a death sentence. He looked at his friends. Let the woods have her. It's what she loves so much, ain't it? A shovel left by some long-gone trapper lay half-buried in the leaves nearby. Caleb, his face pale, but his eyes wide with a terrible excitement, grabbed it. The first shovel of earth hit Waya's face. It was a soft, percussive thud, followed by the sting of grit in her eyes, the taste of cold dirt in her mouth. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the falling soil. Muffled laughter drifted down from above, a sound more terrifying than any snarl of a wolf. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She clawed at the walls of the pit, her fingers digging into the loose earth, but it was useless. The dirt fell faster, a relentless brown rain. It covered her legs, her waist. The weight began to build a crushing pressure on her chest that made it impossible to breathe. The circle of light above shrank from a bright coin to a silver sliver, and then to nothing at all. The laughter faded. The sound of the shovel became a dull, distant thudding, felt more through the vibrations in her bones than heard with her ears. Darkness. Absolute. The weight. Suffocating. Her last breath was a ragged, burning fight for air that she lost. The image of her grandmother's face waiting by the fire flashed in her mind. A promise broken. And then the world was gone. Darkness. It was not the gentle dark of a moonless night filled with the rustle of unseen life. This was a different beast entirely. It was a solid, pressing thing, a weight on the eyes, a smothering blanket woven from silence and soil. The world, once a symphony of wind and whispering leaves, had been reduced to the frantic, muffled drumbeat of her own heart and the taste of cold, damp earth. Time dissolved. Was it minutes, hours, a lifetime? Waya drifted in the suffocating stillness, a place between memory and nothingness. Grandmother, her mind whispered the thought, a spark in the void. I'm sorry. The sky whisper root. She felt the crushing weight on her chest, not as dirt, but as her own failure. Her lungs burned, screaming for air they could not have. The cold began to seep in, a patient thief, stealing the last of her warmth. It would be easy to let go. So easy, to simply close the last of her awareness and drift away on the black, silent river. Peace was here in the quiet, in the deep embrace of the earth. But a flicker of defiance, stubborn and fierce, refused to be extinguished. No. The word was not spoken. It was a pulse, a primal command from the deepest part of her soul, the part that knew how to track, how to heal, how to survive. Not like this. And then she felt it. A vibration. It was faint at first, a tremor in the packed earth around her head. She thought it was the final throes of her own dying body, a nerve shuddering its last. But it came again, stronger this time. A rhythmic, scratching sensation. Thump, scrape, thump. It was real, and it was above her. A new terror, colder and sharper than the fear of suffocation, seized her. A scavenger, a badger or a coyote, drawn by the scent of disturbed earth, digging for the prize buried within. The thought of being torn apart in this suffocating coffin was a horror beyond comprehension. Her body, drained of all strength, tensed. She was a mouse in a trap, hearing the footsteps of the cat. The sound grew more frantic, more powerful. This was not one animal. It was many. The ground above her began to shift, loosening its deadly grip. A small trickle of soil fell onto her face, and with it came a gift more precious than gold. Air. A thin, glorious, life-giving stream of it. She gasped, a ragged choking sound, her lungs seizing on the sudden bounty. and through the small fissure a new sound, the low excited whine of a predator, a new smell, damp fur and wild musk. Then the earth tore open. A single, powerful claw, black and curved, ripped through the soil just inches from her eyes. It was followed by a snout, dark and wet, snuffling frantically at the opening. Waya flinched back as a wild amber eye peered into her tomb, a burning ember in the darkness. It was him, Ghost, the white wolf. Hope, so violent and unexpected it was almost painful, surged through her. But this was no gentle magical rescue. This was a chaotic, instinctual frenzy. The pack, drawn by a scent, a memory, a bond she could not name, was digging with a wild, desperate energy. Dirt flew, roots tore. The hole widened, and in the chaos of their work another claw raked across her arm as she tried to shield her face. Pain, white-hot and sharp, seared through her. She cried out the sound, a raw croak. The pain was an anchor. It grounded her, burned away the fog of near death. The hole was big enough now. Moonlight of brilliant, impossible silver flooded her grave. With a final explosive burst of adrenaline, Waya clawed her way upward. She was a creature of the earth reborn through mud and terror. She broke the surface, collapsing onto the cool, leaf-strewn ground, her body heaving. She choked on the night air, each breath a painful miracle. For a long moment she lay there, a broken thing at the edge of her own empty grave. The world spun around her, a dizzying collage of moonlight-dark trees and silent, watchful shapes. The pack did not surround her like loyal dogs. They stood back, a dozen silver-furred shadows ringing the clearing, their breath pluming in the cold night air. They had not come to comfort her. They had simply answered a call she didn't know she had made. Ghost, the great white wolf, stood apart from the others. He watched her, his head cocked, the amber eyes holding not affection, but a deep, solemn acknowledgement. A debt paid, a balance restored. Then, as one, the pack turned. Without a sound, they dissolved back into the forest, their forms swallowed by the ancient darkness, leaving Waya utterly alone in the heart of the woods, the blood from the fresh claw-shaped wound on her arm, dripping onto the very soil that had so nearly been her tomb. The journey back was a pilgrimage through pain. Every step was a negotiation with a body that screamed to surrender, to lie down and let the indifferent sun claim it. Waya was no ghost, no vengeful spirit risen from the earth with supernatural strength. She was a girl, bruised and bleeding, running on a fire, fueled by the image of her grandmother's face. The forest that had been her sanctuary was now a landscape of obstacles. Thirst was a living thing, a rasp in her throat. Hunger was a hollow ache in her belly. She moved on instinct, the ancient knowledge her grandmother had woven into her soul, now her only guide. She found water not by sight, but by following the flight path of a finch to a hidden seep of moisture at the base of a rock. She chewed on the tough, bitter roots of a burdock plant to dull the gnawing hunger. The sun was her clock, the stars her map. The world had tried to bury her, and in doing so had forced her to become more a part of it than ever before. She was a specter when she finally saw the first wisp of smoke from the town's chimneys. Her clothes were torn, her skin a canvas of dried blood and caked-on mud. The wound on her arm throbbed with a life of its own. The angry red claw marks a stark sigil against her dirt-stained skin. Old Man Hemlock was the first to see her as he repaired a fence post at the edge of his property. His jaw went slack, the hammer falling from his limp hand. He made the sign against evil and stumbled backward, his face a mask of pure, superstitious terror. He did not see a wounded girl. He saw an omen, an impossibility. The word spread faster than a prairie fire. It's the half-breed girl, back from the dead. Jed said she fell, said the canyon took her. By the time Waya reached the door of her own cabin, a small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and dread. She ignored them. Their whispers were the buzz of flies, meaningless now. She pushed the door open. The cabin was still heavy with the scent of sickness and waiting. Her grandmother lay on the cot, her breathing shallow, her eyes closed. Grandmother Waya whispered, her voice cracking. The old woman's eyes fluttered open. For a moment she stared, her mind struggling to reconcile the vision before her with the certainty of her grief. Then recognition dawned, and with it, a wave of life. Little bird, she breathed, tears carving clean paths through the wrinkles on her cheeks. They said you were gone. Waya collapsed to her knees by the cot, burying her face in the thin, rough blanket. The iron wall of her resolve finally crumbled, and she wept for the pain, for the terror, for the simple, overwhelming relief of being home. Her grandmother's frail hand stroked her hair, murmuring soft, ancient words of comfort. It was she who saw the wound first, gently taking Waya's arm. She traced the angry red lines of the scar with a trembling finger, but her eyes held no fear. They held a deep, knowing awe. The guardians have marked you. She whispered, her voice filled with a reverence that silenced Waya's sobs. You are a child of the woods, now and forever. She rose with a new strength and began to tend to the wound, her movements practiced, and sure cleaning it with the very herbs Waya had risked her life to find. Later that day, the law arrived. Sheriff Davies was a tall, weary man with a kind face and a job he hated. He stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, his gaze shifting uncomfortably from Waya's calm-changed face to the raw scar on her arm. Waya, he began, his voice low and even. There are stories going around. Jedediah and his friends are telling folks you had an accident, that you fell into the canyon near the falls. Their story has holes in it bigger than this valley. Waya sat in the cabin's one good chair, her grandmother humming softly by the fire. She looked at the sheriff, her green eyes holding a new depth, an unsettling stillness. The girl he had known, shy, quiet, always looking down, was gone. This was someone else. Is that what they are saying? She asked, her voice flat. It is the sheriff confirmed, stepping inside. But your arm, that's no fall, Waya. Those are claw marks. And the mud on you, you look like you crawled out of the earth itself. If they did something to you, you need to tell me. The law will handle it. I can arrest them by sundown. He was offering justice, the town's justice, a cell at trial, a punishment decided by the same people who had scorned her for a lifetime. Waya looked past him through the small window to the dark waiting line of the trees. She saw the flash of an amber eye, and her memory felt the phantom weight of the earth. She turned her gaze back to the sheriff. The emotional undercurrent of her trauma was there, a vast, dark ocean beneath the surface, but her voice was as calm as the surface of a frozen lake. There is nothing for the law to handle, Sheriff. He took a step closer, his brow furrowed in confusion. Waya, I can't help you if you don't tell me what happened. She held up her scarred arm, not as evidence of a crime, but as a testament. I forgive them, she said, and the words fell into the quiet room with the weight of stones. The sheriff opened his mouth to protest, to argue, but she cut him off, her voice dropping to a low prophetic whisper that raised the hairs on his arms. But the forest does not. The sheriff left the cabin a few minutes later, his face a roadmap of confusion and a new, undefined unease. Waya's words followed him, echoing in the stunned silence of the watching townsfolk. That night in the saloon, Jed laughed the loudest buying rounds for his friends, calling Waya a crazy, lying half-breed. But as he looked out the window into the deep, impenetrable blackness of the woods, his laughter died in his throat. The forest seemed to have drawn closer, its shadows, longer, its silence no longer peaceful, but watchful, waiting. A week passed. The wound on Waya's arm began to heal, the angry red softening into a pale silver scar that starkly resembled the claw of a great wolf. Her grandmother's fever broke her breathing, easing with each cup of tea, brewed from the sky whisper root. The two women existed in a quiet bubble of recovery while outside the town of Cold Creek held its breath. Waya's words had settled over the community not like a balm of forgiveness, but like a low-hanging storm cloud. I forgive them, but the forest does not. It was a prophecy, and everyone was waiting for it to be fulfilled. Jed was the first to feel the forest's memory stir. He was a hunter arrogant in his skill, his trap lines a source of pride and profit. He went to check them at dawn, whistling a tuneless, defiant melody. The whistling died in his throat at the first trap. It was sprung, the jaws empty, the bait gone. Annoyed, he moved to the next. The same, and the next, and the next. His entire line, a dozen traps meticulously set along the game trail, were all sprung. Empty. Not a single one was broken. They had been opened with an impossible, deliberate precision. And around each one, pressed into the soft earth, was a single set of tracks. They were huge, larger than any wolves he had ever seen. And it was always just the one set. As if a lone, massive animal had walked his line calmly, undoing his work one trap at a time. It wasn't an act of hunger. It was an act of instruction. A message. He stood there in the silent woods, the cool morning air suddenly feeling frigid. He felt a gaze on his back, a patient ancient watching from the deep woods. That night he saw Finn at the saloon. "Something's wrong," Jed muttered into his whiskey. "My traps." "It's just a smart wolf, Jed," Finn said, but his own voice lacked conviction. His face was pale. "Animals are animals. This wasn't an animal." Jed shot back, his voice low and ragged. "This was a judgment." Finn didn't answer, because the day before he had gone to the well behind his family's farmhouse. The thick rope, bought new just last month, was gone. It had been severed the end, a mess of chewed, shredded fibers, and the heavy oak bucket had been dropped into the dark, watery depths. As he peered over the edge into the blackness, he saw something impossible. For a split second, a reflection that was not his own stared back. 2 points of light like torch-lit amber glowed in the darkness and then vanished. He stumbled back from the well, his heart hammering, a scream caught in his throat. A porcupine, his father had said. A thirsty bear, maybe. But Finn knew what he saw, or what he thought he saw. The forest's judgment was a quiet, creeping thing. Caleb was the last. He was the one who had wielded the shovel, his face twisted with a follower's cruel glee. Now he was haunted. He saw Waya's face in his dreams, the dirt striking her skin. He couldn't sleep. Seeking the solace of hard labor, he went to chop firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a way to drown out the guilt in his own head. He chose a dead pine at the edge of a clearing. As he raised the axe for a final splitting blow, the world erupted. Not with a sound, but with a sudden silent explosion of black wings. Every tree surrounding the clearing, which had seemed empty moments before, disgorged its population of crows. Hundreds of them. They rose into the air in a single terrifying mass, their cause a deafening chorus of accusation. They swooped and swirled around him, a vortex of black feathers and angry cries. He cried out, stumbling backward, throwing his arms up to shield his face. He tripped over a root. The axe flew from his grasp, its momentum carrying it in a glittering arc that ended with a sickening wet thud in his own thigh. Pain, blinding and absolute. He lay on the ground, his blood staining the pine needles a dark, rich red as the crows settled back into the trees, watching him in an unnerving collective silence. News of Caleb's accident sealed the legend. It was no longer a question. The townspeople who once scorned Waya now gave her a wide berth, their eyes filled with a new and potent emotion, fear. Small, pathetic offerings began to appear on the path to her cabin, a tied bundle of tobacco, a single perfect apple, a freshly caught fish left on a stone. They were not gifts of friendship. They were pleas for mercy. Waya saw it all. She heard the whispers. She saw the fear in Finn's eyes when he scurried across the street to avoid her. She knew about Jed's traps about Caleb's leg. Her face remained a calm, unreadable mask. She continued to tend to her grandmother to forage for herbs to move through the world with her newfound quiet serenity. She was not the source of their misfortune. She was merely a witness. She had relinquished her own right to vengeance, and in doing so had allowed a far older, more powerful justice to take its course. The breaking point came a month after her return. Jed, his hunting business ruined his nights sleepless, and his mind frayed by paranoia, finally snapped. He saw her leaving the mercantile, a small sack of flour in her arms. He stormed across the street, his face pale and wild, his hands shaking. Caleb limped behind him, his face a permanent mask of pain. "You!" Jed screamed, his voice cracking. The whole street fell silent. "You did this, all of it." He pointed a trembling finger at her, his eyes wide with madness. "You're a witch. You cursed us." Jed's accusation hung in the dead still air, a raw, ragged sound against the town's collective silence. Witch, cursed. The words were meant to be a branding iron, a final desperate attempt to cage her in their fear. The crowd watched their faces, pale and uncertain, waiting for her defense, her denial, her rage. Waya gave them none of it. She looked past Jed's wild, terrified eyes and saw the whole of Cold Creek arrayed before her. She saw the blacksmith who had taught his son contempt. She saw the merchant who always gave her chipped goods. She saw the women who pulled their children closer when she passed. They were all there, trapped in a prison of their own making. A profound calm born in the suffocating darkness of her own grave settled over her. The emotional storm had passed long ago, leaving behind a deep, quiet clarity. "There is no curse, Jed," she said, her voice not loud but carrying with an astonishing authority that cut through the tension. It was the voice of the wind through the pines, soft but unyielding. "There is only the forest, and the forest keeps its own balance." She took a step forward, and Jed flinched back as if she had struck him. "You went into the woods and acted like predators." Waya continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But you did so without knowledge, without respect. You tore a hole in the fabric of things with your cruelty. You left a wound." Her eyes finally settled on Jed, pinning him with an unnerving, compassionate pity. "The forest does not seek revenge. It is not human. It simply heals. It restores its own order. When a tree falls, new saplings grow to take the light. When a life is unjustly taken, the land remembers. It pushes back until the balance is found." She gestured toward the silent watching woods that ringed the town. "Your fear is not of me. It is of the silence where you once found pride. It is of the tracks you can no longer read. It is of the reflection you see when you look into the water of a still creek." She held up her arm, displaying the silvery, claw-shaped scar for all to see. It was not a mark of a curse. It was a covenant, a promise. "This is not my mark," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It is the forest's. And it simply says that I belong to it just as it belongs to itself. You are afraid because you have finally realized you do not." She needed to say no more. The truth of it settled over the crowd, undeniable and absolute. Jed stood there, broken, his accusations turned to ash in his mouth. He was not defeated by magic, but by a simple, crushing truth he could no longer escape. Waya turned her back on him, on all of them. Her business with the town of Cold Creek was finished. She walked away, not back to her cabin, but directly toward the tree line, her form growing smaller and smaller until she was swallowed by the shadows of the pines. She did not look back. The seasons turned. The story of Waya became a legend, whispered around winter fires, a cautionary tale of a justice that did not carry a badge or a gun. She was rarely seen in town anymore. She had no need of it. The forest provided all she and her grandmother required. But sometimes a lone hunter or a lost child would stumble upon a clearing deep in the woods and see her. She would be moving through the trees not as a visitor, but as a part of the landscape itself. Her steps silent, her presence serene. And they would swear that walking beside her, his white fur a startling brightness against the deep green, was a great wolf. They moved together not as master and pet, but as two guardians of an ancient silent world. Two souls who had found their true place far from the noise of men in the heart of the woods that always, in the end, restores its own balance.